Thanks for joining us for C4Net's webinar series. This is the 5th episode in our Moving Towards a Whole of System Approach to Energy Planning in Australia series. I'm James Seymour, CEO of C4Net, and I'll be your MC for today's webinar, Rethink, Rewire, Harnessing Smarter Distribution for a Future-Ready Grid. The discussion today is designed to spark conversations and share valuable insights into the opportunity to better harness both capacity and flexibility within distribution systems to lower the transition cost for all. We'll also touch on some of the evolution needed in long-term integrated system planning to improve investment decisions and navigate uncertainty. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands of which we all meet today. For me, I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders, past and present. Today's webinar, we've got two fantastic speakers. Professor Pierluigi Mancarella from the University of Melbourne, who has led some really interesting research here, but also been one of the key architects of the overall ESP research program. And then we'll hear a different perspective from industry, where Charlotte Eddy, the General Manager of Strategy and Regulation for the distribution side of AusNet Services, will provide that real lived experience side as well from industry. Both speakers will present to you, but there's then a real opportunity for you to engage. And so we really encourage you to please post your questions or comments into the chat or the Q&A function that you see down the bottom in your Zoom control panel. And we'll address those questions and try and group them together and bring them forward for our speakers to directly address them following their presentations in the discussion section. We will be recording today's webinar and we'll post that recording on our website shortly after the webinar has finished for those who weren't able to join us, or if there's any part that you wish to go back to. We've posted the other 4 episodes of this series on the website as well. And thank you for all the positive feedback and everything. It's clearly been well received, so we're delighted to keep bringing them to you. All right, for today's webinar, I'm just going to provide a little bit of background and introduction, and then we're going to pass over to Pierluigi. C4Net, or the Centre for New Energy Technologies, began the Enhanced System Planning project a few years ago to address an opportunity. And that opportunity was around that where we've got the fantastic integrated system plan of today, focused on generation transmission, and that opportunity to expand it more to look at different areas from a more whole of system approach. In particular, we've focused in on the distribution, incorporation of distribution system considerations into that. That's been the project's been highly collaborative. It's industry, it's AEMO, it's governments and researchers all coming together to try and address these challenges. One of the key questions that couldn't be answered at the start was how to frame up the relative appeal of an investment into transmission versus distribution to address some of the challenges. And it's not to say one or the other. It's to say, how could it be balanced across to get the lowest overall cost? How could policymakers, investors, system planners meaningfully assess the options of a fully integrated approach when there's no whole of system plan? That landscape that we're operating in, changing very fast. The CER and DR coming onto the online rapidly, but also we've got the challenge of connecting in large-scale assets, wind, solar, storage, into our system to help decarbonise and make that more rapid. The overall enhanced system plan has the research complete. We're just compiling the results now, and we'll be publishing those very soon and look forward to sharing them with you. We're really pleased with how it's all gone. Today's an opportunity for a little bit of a sneak peek into one of really the key areas that's there. And that's the outcome of the University of Melbourne's investigation. They've used an investment coupled whole of system planning approach to have a look at asset connection. And in particular, they've identified many opportunities to connect large-scale assets at lower cost and more efficiently within the sub-transmission areas of the distribution system, or the really high voltage areas of the distribution system. They do so by embracing the flexibility through an active distribution network. And that's a concept that Pierluigi will take us a bit more through. And seeing where we have aligned incentives for smarter local investment, we see that we can ease congestion, improve reliability, and cut overall system costs. This could be multi-billion-dollar type savings across the NEM. Now, is this just a straight swap out of where do I connect the assets, or is it important which sequence they're connected in and where they're connected and how they're planned and operated from an integrated viewpoint? There's some of the key issues that we'll touch on. But we've certainly seen enough to suggest that there's very strong merit for an ESP-like approach nationally. And what I mean by that, a bottoms-up, more looking at how key distribution considerations can be scalably and efficiently considered in an integrated whole of system approach. And that's really where we've focused the project on. Interestingly, while there's the connections of and utilizing flexibility in that sub-transmission area, looks like there's even better value if we can extend further down into the low voltage areas of the grid. But of course, that comes with some complexity, but the potential is there. So look, to get into it, let's start off with Professor Pierluigi Mancarella.
Thank you. So again, thanks, James, for the introduction. What I'm going to show is a bit the work across the past 1.5 years, pretty much, talking about these ideas of the benefits from assessing better flexibility we can extract from distribution network, distributed energy resources and consumer energy resources, and the trade-offs in terms of investment, both for resources and the networks, transmission and distribution. Now, what is somehow the context and motivation of this work? I call this a Copernican revolution because it comes a long way from the way that traditional grids were run, including the fact that effectively all the control was at transmission level, supplying a distribution network that was fundamentally passive because it was like inflexible demand, no generation, no much control at all in the network. Effectively, the network was built to be kind of big enough to deal with the worst case scenario, because there were effectively no reason to control the networks. Then, of course, things start becoming more complex with new technology like distributed resources coming up into the grid, somehow making the network a little bit more active with this kind of embedded generation that we modeled initially as negative demand, of course. With a more and more active network, however, with increasing penetration of these resources, we needed to start doing things a little bit differently, because at some point, congestions started emerging. Congestions at this point effectively means that we have to curtail, in most cases, renewables. No, that's a form of congestion, the form of congestion we see in distribution. We've never seen congestion before because we would never curtail somehow customers on the other side, on the load side, unless there was some major events. But now, because we're operating an active network also in the opposite direction, we may have to deal with congestion, renewable curtailment in particular. That's how we started with the idea of let's have batteries to deal with this congestions and effectively try to curtail rest renewables. Of course, at the same time, a lot is happening at the transmission level too, with large-scale renewables being developed. And actually, Australia is the perfect case where somehow we have deep penetration of both happening in parallel. Probably we're the best example in the world, and it's really fascinating. That's why lots of opportunities may be created. So because of all these renewables here at the transmission and the distribution network together, now we start feeling the pressure of actually electrifying more and more various services, particularly heating and transport, because the opportunity is unique to improve energy efficiency and decarbonize the whole system by electrifying. Effectively, we know that moving from conventional vehicles, boilers, and so on, to electric vehicles, heat pumps, and so on, brings lots of benefits in terms of less energy being used, but at the same time, much cleaner energy being used because we can deploy renewable energy also for these other services that otherwise would use fossil fuels. So obviously, with this now, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and then storage that is happening in the grid too, particularly to be paid with rooftop PVs. Now the demand side become flexible. So before it was inflexible, the active part of the grid at distribution level was only because of renewables. But all these technologies, electric vehicles, heat pumps, there is thermal storage associated with that, of course, batteries. These are effectively all the different forms of storage that can create huge opportunities for flexibility on the demand side. Now, because of these active systems that we now have, in which we have both active generation, flexible demand, so an active demand potentially, we really need to develop now intelligently the planning of both networks and active resources if we truly want to get an economic optimum, a techno-economic optimum. In fact, this is what happens in transmission. We co-plan somehow transmission and generation because it is economically optimal and techno-economically optimal to do that. There is now no reason, given that we also have in distribution active resources, both supply side and demand side, as well as the opportunity to plan more intelligently networks. So there's no reason why we shouldn't perform this integrated planning of distribution and DR, both generation and demand side in distribution too. So when you do that effectively, what happens is that you can interact more and more also with transmission side in a better way now that you have all this flexibility available at distribution to deal in particular with variability and partly unpredictability of large-scale renewables too. Now, to do that, of course, you need to improve what you have at distribution level, because you need to create visibility and controllability for the system operator to actually be able to interact efficiently with the transmission grid. So it's no longer enough to do this at the distribution level, so an integrated operation plan at distribution level. If you really want to extract value from your distributed resources for a whole system perspective, you need to make these resources more visible somehow at the system level to be able to interact with the transmission grid. This effectively means that we need to change the architecture of distribution system, in fact, introducing a number of new kind of stakeholders or concepts, like fundamentally aggregation concepts, such as virtual power plants, energy communities, microgrids, and so on. But it's not the only way of doing it. You can also foster somehow flexibility and intelligence way by using tariff structures or pricing, or there may be different mechanisms that can be used. However, whatever we do, we know that there is lots of flexibility that we could potentially now use to interact with transmission grid. And in order to do this, we need also something new happening in the distribution network. It's just not try to plan the network better. You now need to actively operate this network in a better way, because now effectively it's no longer a network. It's a system with all these active resources. That's why we prefer to talk about active system, and we prefer to talk about distribution system operator. So this DSO rather than a distribution network operator. So when we do all this, eventually we really have the opportunity to try to understand, now that we have two systems, transmission systems and distribution systems with system operators in both grids, and active resources in both grids, how they can actively, optimally interacting with each other, providing flexibility to each other, and exchange the resources with each other. Of course, there are operational aspects, but then there are planning aspects. What resources do I build where, and how much networks do I need to build at the two levels to actually support these resources? The way we're doing things now effectively is we keep thinking a lot supply-centric with a focus on the transmission grid. At the same time, we are discussing more and more and started building opportunities for consumer-centric system and grid. Well, I mean, obviously, these two things is great that we're doing, but they cannot stay in isolation like this, because otherwise we have the risk that we build a fantastically good transmission grid, a fantastically good distribution grid with all the active management and resources in each grid, but they don't talk to each other. And therefore, what will happen is that we really run the risk to build eventually two grids. This is a material risk that we're actually running. So somehow, because of this, this is really the motivation that we should be able to integrate in planning, so perform a true integrated whole system planning of large-scale resources and DR on the other side, as well as of transmission networks and distribution networks or systems more generally, and truly integrate systems and the resources attached with these systems. Now, I think we are on the right path, but there is a lot of work to do. We need to demonstrate lots of things. When you look at what IEMO, so this is the ISP 2024, obviously the projection is that gigantic amounts of distributed resources will be part of future grid. In particular, when you look at, for example, when you look at rooftop PV, but also when you look at coordinated storage in consumer energy resources, effectively distributed batteries, electric vehicles, heat pumps, thermal storage, water, and so on. Now, in particular, there is lots of storage that potentially will be available in distribution grids. Here see coordinated CR storage. So there is lots of reliance on this. However, the assumption is also that somehow the network will be probably augmented to facilitate the adoption. Now, IEMO is developing, in the new ISP, is revisiting this assumption, and they're starting implementing a more comprehensive assessment, including what is required at distribution level to actually for this assumption to be true or not, to be tested somehow. However, in reality, this augmentation may just not happen without appropriate planning at the distribution level. At the moment, it's not really happening. At the same time, if we keep missing the coordination between the two systems, we will never be able to capture truly the trade-offs between investment in the resource at large scale and small scale levels. But also, somehow, we will not understand the true value of orchestrating distributed energy resources, not only for local network purposes, local support, but also potentially to interact more with the transmission grid, with the whole system. So eventually, what will happen is that risk of building two grids will stay material. You can try to do very well in two grids, but you do not really integrate properly in planning, and you don't understand really properly the value of DR in providing support to both systems, then effectively you will not achieve the techno-economical optimal that you could get. And more importantly, this is very important also for consumers, you may not be able to extract the true benefits and of course potential impact of distributed energy resources and consumer energy resources in particular. So what is happening in this kind of context? Now again, starting from the status quo, if you allow me to use like a very simple toy representation of a system. Imagine that the transmission system effectively is like simply 3 nodes, and to these nodes there are distribution networks that are attached. Now this, for example, a representation of a low voltage network that we have studied, we're still studying actually in the project, and then there will be different resources attached to this network. Now the way that things work so far is there is a passive network view of what is happening in distribution. So distribution and distributed resources are really not taking the active part in system planning. And in fact, the majority of the planning that we see happening in the ISP is at the transmission level, because effectively that is really the context, the original context of the ISP. What is happening, however, is that these distribution networks in reality, especially in the kind of vision that we're trying to develop, are not just passive networks. They are transforming themselves from passive networks to active distribution systems as I said. Effectively now, the entire distribution network can be represented as some kind of operational map that includes all the flexibility opportunities, both in terms of active and reactive power, to interact with the transmission grid. So effectively, the entire distribution network is now an active resource that is aggregating technically and economically all the distributed resources that are connected to the network. Obviously, this equivalent resource can actively potentially interact with the transmission grid if there are the right incentives, the right mechanisms in terms of operation. Then, of course, you can do this in terms of planning too. By the way, for people that would be familiar with, for example, the operational maps of synchronous generators in transmission grids, this picture I'm showing here actually looks very much like the operational maps of a synchronous generator. However, it's not a synchronous generator. It's the operational map with already all the network constraints are included in the modeling of an active distribution network. So effectively, we can build models, and we can then operate distribution networks to make them look very similarly to synchronous generators and eventually interact with other resources at the transmission level. So if you look at from this perspective, having now an active distribution system, so what will happen is that these active distribution systems can be modeled in equivalent operationally, basically like synchronous generators or any kind of generators can be, of course, renewables and storage would be modeled in a similar way. We can also attach a cost function to these equivalent generators that take into account the investment that is needed to support the operation of that network or that entire system. For example, if we need to reinforce the network to unlock more capacity in distribution. So in each point, for each penetration level of DR, there'll be a certain cost associated with that to be able to effectively operate the network in the way that I'm describing here. But once you have an operational model and a cost function that changes with the penetration level of DR, effectively this is a model that can be implemented directly into, for example, the ISP, because it's not very different from what the ISP is doing. So you start seeing lots of active distribution systems that can play an active role in planning that potentially could displace transmission level investments. We will see a shift probably of resources from transmission to, first of all, from conventional resources to renewable resources, because now you have a lot more flexibility that you could potentially access from the distribution level. We know that we will need more flexibility with more large-scale resources. At the same time, there can be trade-offs to be built. For example, you can start imagining that it would be more cost-efficient to build more distributed resources and build a new network infrastructure distribution level to facilitate distributed energy resources, rather than building somehow and build more and more of this, rather, for example, building more of transmission level resources. Also because in some cases, we just cannot build more resources at the transmission level because it may be problematic, for example, to build new transmission lines, may be problematic to build, to some extent, renewable energy zones and so on. So it really creates an opportunity to provide a shift of resources and investment. So eventually we developed a methodology, a bottom-up methodology to say, by parameterizing through this, what we call, the kind of investment cost functions, what would be needed at the level of distributed energy resources, and by building somehow an equivalent model of the flexibility that you could extract from the distribution level, eventually we could build a representation, a bottom-up representation of the entire flexibility that could be provided to a transmission network in the form of the so-called nodal operating envelopes. Now, many of you will be familiar with dynamic operating envelopes that will be applied at each resource level, each consumer level, depending on how you define it. Well, a nodal operating envelope is the kind of map, the kind of aggregated representation of all the operational flexibility in imports and export, in active and reactive power terms, or what the entire distribution network could do. It's called nodal because you will have some nodal references. For example, the interface with the transmission grid. So eventually, for different penetration level of DR, you could develop equivalent cost functions as well as equivalent operational models, these nodal operating envelopes, that could be made interacting with the transmission grid. So to kind of demonstrate the applicability of the methodology and actually all the processes embedded in the methodology, we tested this against high voltage networks in Victoria. This is very scalable, as we show you later, but it was easy to find information on high voltage networks and real connection inquiries for relatively large distributed resources, like solar farms, batteries, and so on. Eventually, we built these cost functions that I mentioned before. These are real cost functions that were built for these distribution networks. And now, with this, we can try to say, okay, now that we have the cost functions of what it would take to unlock investment for resources, different penetration level in distribution, how would this interact with the distribution system? And before doing that properly, we also need to build an equivalent flexibility of these resources. Effectively, what we did, this is like operationally, you can build kind of time series to demonstrate for different networks what are the export and the import limits, again, very familiar terms, by the nodal level for the entire distribution network for different networks, and eventually say, if this is the model, this is the nodal envelope for these networks. What happens if you build more distribution network? Eventually, you have an opportunity to enlarge the flexibility of the available from the resources, eventually corresponding to have larger and larger envelopes. So parametrically, effectively, you can assess the flexibility you have available in distribution networks with increasing penetration level of DR and how much it costs to unlock it. So you can take this and you can compare it with what you can build in transmission and how much it will cost to unlock those transmission resources, eventually generation and storage. So we tested this then inside the ISP and then say, if you consider, again, the ISP 2024 and those distribution networks that I mentioned above, and consider the augmentations that you need in the Victorian renewable energy zones, what happens if you do not consider any of these flexibility options at distribution? Effectively, what happens is that you would, of course, augment transmission with a total of 13.4 gigawatts. I mean, the numbers may not be exact, but I think that it's quite, I mean, the model is very close to what IEMO would see actually in the ISP here. And then this would be to support certain developments in solar and wind, as well as some batteries in different renewable energy zones. Then, what happens if you enable this integrated model, integrated assessment of investment in transmission and distribution? So effectively, what happens now that you need a lot more transmission, only 8 gigawatts instead of 13 gigawatts, effectively. And now you're starting building more distribution, of course, and you change somehow the allocation of resources, because now you connect some of these resources at the distribution level, and effectively you shift the mix from the previous one, and some large-scale batteries to somehow completely different shifts, particularly much less battery capacity needed transmission, because you can use more and more the flexibility available at the distribution level to do that. Now, you cannot stop. You may not stop there, because effectively you can go down to low voltage network modeling with the methodology that we're showing. This is particularly important when you look at electrification and consumer energy resources. This will be key to assess the potential reduction in distribution investment the moment that you electrify, for example, heating and transport, as well as how much intelligence you need to build. So on the one hand, you can save network investments. On the other hand, you need to build intelligence, because you need to harness the flexibility of these distributed resources. For example, here I'm showing picture taken from some work that I did years ago when I was at Imperial College, effectively showing that if you consider just like a kind of passive network, when you have electric vehicles and heat pumps, this is a UK case, but it's very similar for Australia. When you consider electric vehicles and heat pumps, being part of the grid. Now, the energy increase that you would see across the distribution network, for example, would be in the order of 50%, but the actual capacity requirements will grow in the order of 100%. Actually, this is telling us that the network becomes more peakier, much more peakier, because both heat and transport peaks would add on top of the traditional peaks. However, if you control or you facilitate intelligently the management, the orchestration of DR, what happens is that it will reduce significantly the peak requirements down to 30%, so that the increase in peak will be disproportionately less than the increase in energy. Effectively, you increase utilization of distribution networks by creating intelligence into the grid. You develop a much more efficient network in a way. On top of that, as I said, so this is like for the local network, but at the whole system level, you try to understand how much storage actually you can unlock and how much value this flexibility has got the moment you can interact also with the large-scale resources. And in fact, when you model now low-voltage networks and then bottom-up, effectively you will have storage that is can be used locally for active network management, storage that can be used to interact with transmission grid, and storage that might be used, but unfortunately cannot because networks are creating constraints. However, for example, we reinforced distribution networks, we could unlock the storage, and again, this may be providing more benefits than, for example, building more resources at the transmission level. Eventually, we are building this kind of bottom-up modeling, starting from each house, basically. This is a model we are finalizing now within the project, and say how much flexibility we can hierarchically build, eventually to provide a full picture of the trade-offs between flexibility and investment, between transmission and between and distribution, of course, with a focus on all that you have in distribution networks. And this, I'd say, the methodology has been designed to be scalable, to be directly used by the ESPs, not to change significantly the planning methodology they're doing, actually not at all, but eventually to take the results of the current models or methodologies and then pass it somehow to AIMO, so that AIMO would also be able to incorporate this, for example, in the integrated system plan or other tools and studies that the tools they use or studies they carry out. So yeah, that's it for me. Sorry, I went probably a little bit along. Apologies for that. And of course, now there will be plenty of questions. I hope later we'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Pierluigi just outlined some of the opportunity that's there, and we may go into some of those potential savings and everything a bit deeper when he comes back on as well. So why aren't we doing that, or what is the industry perspective now? And Charlotte is going to join us now, but uniquely from an AusNet services perspective, AusNet Services is represented at both transmission and distribution and has one of those unique views right across the system and sees the opportunities there.
So I'm going to talk a bit about AusNet's distribution networks work on investments in our sub-transmission network. And this is to enable projects to connect and us to unlock their exports at the very large generation end that want to connect into our sub-transmission network. We currently have over 110 connection inquiries of around totaling 4.3 gigawatts of energy in these areas, focused in Gippsland around the Morwell area and also up in Wodonga. And these are areas where there's a lot of developer interest because the wind and solar resources are good. So we have taken the initiative to scope up projects that would proactively upgrade the network to unlock the generation from multiple of these connection applications. And this addresses the classic first mover problem, where under the current connections framework, in the regulatory framework, the first generator to connect has to foot the whole bill of the upgrade needed to unlock capacity to enable their export. So under these arrangements, we're finding that no one wants to be the first generator, and therefore none of the generation that could be built is getting built. Now, I have to say there is existing generation in these areas and existing capacity that is being used, but there is more interest than capacity to unlock it. Now, the projects that we developed are proactive investments that we could make in these locations, and essentially they are line upgrades or the addition of a parallel line. And the total cost of the 4 projects is around 156 million, and that would unlock around 950 megawatts of these potential connections. To scope up these projects, we have carried out market modelling that utilises assumptions underpinning the ISP. And the ISP is essentially the baseline that we're looking at when we're assessing the merits of these projects. And our modelling then tests the incremental benefit of investment in sub-transmission to unlock additional generation on top of the ISP assumptions. So in the short term, it therefore doesn't offset transmission investment as per the ISP, but it's justified in addition. And we find that still these sub-transmission investments economically stack up. These sub-transmission investments deliver wholesale market benefit of 85 million over 20 years. And this is a benefit shared by all NEM customers, so broader than AusNet customers, and lowers CO2 emissions by around 2.7 metric tonnes, which is then costed under the regulatory framework to assess the economics of the projects. And we find that they are economically justified. And in fact, 3 of the 4 have completed or are currently going through the RIT process. Now, these projects are low cost relative to other solutions, including transmission. So we estimate these at around 200k per megawatt, and estimate transmission solutions are upwards of 0.5 million, so 500k per megawatt. The other advantages of sub-transmission investment relative to transmission, they can be delivered more quickly. Those are on existing easements, and there's fewer social license issues expected compared to establishing new transmission lines. However, the downside is that it obviously doesn't unlock the scale seen at transmission level. We've consulted on these investments with our customers through the course of our EDPR engagement process. We found that generally there was support for leveraging existing assets through prudently augmenting to enable more capacity in a timely manner. However, because, as I'll get to on the next slide, because these investments sort of aren't included in any formal plan, I think there is a need to build confidence with customers still that these investments are a prudent part of the overall energy plan. And we've included those 4 investments in our EDPR price review submission for 2026 to 31 that is currently being assessed by the Australian energy regulator. So why aren't we just delivering these projects today? Essentially, for us right now, the certainty of cost recovery is an issue. We haven't been funded for these projects in the current 5-year regulatory period. And that's not a comment on the AR, because we didn't ask for these projects to be included in our revenue allowance, as these connection inquiries have really taken off over the last 5 years or so. We've also got a lot of pressures on our capital expenditure currently. With the inflationary environment, our costs of delivering projects have gone up significantly. Peak demand is starting to tick up again. And our customers are also concerned about network reliability and resilience to extreme weather events, which are requiring investments to address those needs as well. We're under capital efficiency incentive schemes and also face ex-post review risk, which means that costs may not be recovered at all if we spend higher than our capital allowance. So for these reasons, it's prudent for us to hold off until we've got more certainty, as we'll get through our regulatory process, about whether these projects will be funded through the regulatory framework or not. Also, while these projects do meet the requirements of the national electricity rules, they do pass the economic test, and our view is they are in the long-term interest of customers to deliver. To our knowledge, the AER hasn't yet considered and approved similar projects for other distribution networks, so the approach that will be taken to assessing them is uncertain. And we are able to make these prioritisation decisions in this way, as distributors don't have a positive obligation to proactively invest to unlock large renewable connections. The need for us to unlock large renewable connection capacity is really dealt with under the regulatory framework through that first mover pays framework that I described earlier. The second point is that sub-transmission investment is not yet part of an integrated system plan. Now, as the benefits accrue to customers beyond just AusNets, optimising across sub-transmission networks of different distributors, as well as considering the integration with transmission, will be important. Now, AEMO is currently considering how distribution should be incorporated into the ISP, and we think that it is very important that this considers sub-transmission investment as well as the LV network's potential. Our expectation of the upcoming VicGrid transmission plan is that it will understandably focus on transmission. So there could still be a gap for sub-transmission from a broader planning perspective. And there may be implications from this. Without a positive requirement for distributors to invest, having these projects form part of an integrated plan will certainly be helpful to consider to facilitate regulatory approvals. And finally, AusNet customers are paying for these investments should they get funded, while all NEM customers benefit. More dispatchable renewables lower wholesale market prices for all NEM customers, whereas the network investment will be funded by just AusNet customers. And while the bill impact is very low, so we estimate these projects will cost our residential customers less than $1 a year. Every dollar counts, particularly in the current cost of living crisis. Now, we have had some customer feedback in consulting on these projects that this is seen as AusNet doing our bit, and it's a good thing for AusNet to be investing in these types of projects despite the imperfect cost recovery arrangements. But nonetheless, there's still a need to provide confidence that these projects are the right thing to do in the broader context. Other distributors making similar investments may mean that this issue could essentially be swings and roundabouts, and it is a relatively low impact of in terms of the bill impact from these investments, less than $1 per year per residential customer for these 4 projects. So, there's a big administrative cost burden, time lag associated with sorting out perfect cost recovery for these investments, which may not ultimately, optimize outcomes for customers either. We don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. But however, it would be desirable to have more equitable cost sharing arrangements over the medium term. We just think it shouldn't be a barrier to do what makes sense today. Well, that was all I was going to cover, and looking forward to answering any questions.
Charlotte, you touched on some of the issues there that are just so pertinent, and it's not saying that anything's someone hasn't done their job or something. It's that we've got new problems to address here. So this is a chance for the regulatory regime to change. I'd be really interested, maybe as we do talk as well, just around the pace of that change and the regulatory cycles that are there, and how they're matched given such rapid increase in the opportunity now as well. So that will be one that we can come back to. Interestingly, though, look, thanks a lot. There's some great questions coming into the chat here, and I'm actually going to go to the first one because it touches a little bit on just that. We might start with Pierluigi, but Charlotte, I'd be really interested from a regulatory side, and that is DR or CR orchestration is to deliver lowest cost solution or create opportunities for energy trading businesses to make money. DNSPs are agnostic to the value of energy, so are ideally placed to facilitate rather than orchestrate consumer energy cost efficiency through DOEs. How do we answer that in the NER? Pierluigi, would you like to share any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks, team. Always very insightful questions from you. I think there is a little bit of everything in there. I think there are big opportunities for consumer energy resources to become kind of to play a much more active role, but there will be also others somehow that they could use the. Oh, sorry, there's something is happening with my video.
It's okay. That's all right. There you go. We're back.
Yeah, sorry. So I was saying, I think there are opportunities for consumers, and there are opportunities also for others. For example, aggregators and retailers actually to interact more actively. Now, I think we need to be very careful, and also the regulator somehow try to understand exactly how to facilitate in one direction or another. Can you do, for example, without intermediate stakeholders? For example, can you do without aggregators, for example? I think there is a lot that could be done by pricing, for example, but there is quite some work to be done there. So what you're hinting there is absolutely correct. I think the role of the kind of, let's call it the future distribution system operator, is really that of facilitating system operation. The same as the role of the system operator in transmission is actually to facilitate market operation and system security in a way. So that they should somehow mirror each other. Now, is the DOE's dynamic operating envelopes the best way of doing that? I think it is a really good way of doing that. I think there would be a mix of all the different options we have available. There would be a mix of dynamic operating envelopes, of network pricing, and then to some extent also, for example, opportunities for aggregators, virtual power plants, energy communities to play in that space. I think really that there is the opportunities for everyone. I don't think we have an answer, but what we're trying to build is a framework so that all these options can be assessed on a like for like basis. They be compared with each other in a proper way. At the moment, I don't think we have this kind of framework yet.
And I'd note, Tim, the guidance to the researchers here was not to pick necessarily the mechanism by which, it was more to understand the value created, given the logic that if there is sufficient value created, well, then we can go and look at how that's divided up and everything. And those who are better placed to actually do that, as long as you know there's value created, significant costs avoided and everything, well, then you're in an environment that you can look at, well, how do we now align the incentives of all the various actors within there, whether it be through market mechanisms or standards or compliances and everything. There's whole lots of opportunities in there. Charlotte, was there anything you wanted to add to that one?
Yeah, and to your point, really, I think customers are going to need to see value from this to participate. So it will be essential that however this ends up happening, there's monitoring to make sure that it isn't just an opportunity for profits, and customers are seeing the value of it to enable that value to be unlocked.
Excellent. Pierluigi, with that, is there, with the large-scale connections coming in at the sub-transmission, does it even need, can it be benign down to the low voltage areas and the consumers, or do you have to have that component in there as well? Or these additional elements that can be unlocked?
No, I think anything that is happening, it doesn't need to happen at the let's say low voltage level to be beneficial for consumers. Like the opportunities for consumers for consumer energy resources, of course, become bigger the moment that you consider all of them, and that brings value to the whole system. However, anything that you can do better now, for example, if our modeling, what Charlotte presented shows that there is a clear trade-off to invest more, for example, at lower voltage level compared to transmission. It's a sub-transmission, it's HV distribution. Certainly there is value, and there is money that can be saved significantly for the system. These savings are translated into consumer bills eventually. So the whole process itself of performing better integrated planning will have benefits for the consumers anyway, regardless of whether we are involving directly in a more active participation, for example, consumer energy resources. We should do anyway, but the value of planning in an integrated way exists anyway, because all the cost savings will be passed on to consumers eventually.
And when you talk about DER here, you're talking right through to very large scale assets, aren't you?
Yeah. So DER, I use here a terminology that's kind of more like what the word somehow sees as terminology. So distributed energy resources is anything that is basically connected to distribution network, particularly I would say medium voltage, low voltage, but also high voltage distribution can be considered actually distributed energy resources. Whereas then by CR we really mean those connected really at the consumer's premises, effectively behind the meter, very, very small scale in the way that we have introduced actually this concept in Australia. My understanding is that we created this concept of CR. But DR is more generally any resource that can be connected to a distribution network. And that's why there is lots of trade-offs that you can build there with DR and distribution and the large-scale transmission, even if you do not go down to the CR level.
Ian Jennings has asked a question around the timing, given, and you both called out the risk of duplicate assets or inefficient investments and everything. So, given the forecast for demand and distribution generation and how they change, how quickly is action required to prevent or mitigate unnecessary expenditure, do you think?
Very soon. It's coming at us very quickly, and one that we're keeping a very close eye on in particular is the Victorian government's regulatory impact statement around gas electrification, which would ban replacing a gas appliance with a gas appliance, and that could drive some very large increases in peak demand very quickly. So any flexibility that we can get as soon as possible is going to be really helpful to unlock the value.
Is there anything that we need to hold off for? Is there anything that needs to be addressed first before we go and start moving down this pathway? And what I mean by that is if we were to move to more of a whole of system and an integrated approach, is there data sharing or anything there that would be a barrier to doing it at the moment? Or should we have confidence that we've got enough to start moving down this pathway now?
I think we can take steps down this pathway now, and I think we already are. I mean, AEMO looking at integrating distribution into the ISP is a really good stepping stone. The ESP work is fantastic too, so we're building towards it. We just need to do it quicker.
Very good.
I agree. The methodology, somehow developing methodologies and processes for these systems to start talking more to each other, I think is the very essential first step.
Excellent. Neil Gibbs, who's been a fantastic supporter of exploring this area for quite a while, he's asked, does the system security, planning and operationally become more complex in a world where distribution systems are activated as suggested here?
Okay, I think Charlotte, then maybe I will comment.
You go, Pierluigi.
Okay, so I think it's probably rather the opposite. I think system security is more complex, because it's like the grid with renewables is actually somehow more fragile, so to speak. There are more issues that we now engineers are solving. We need a few more years, but certainly compared to the traditional grid, it's currently more fragile, and we need the new processes in place. For example, if you look at ability to disconnect or pre-disconnect rooftop PVs, because they could contribute to contingencies on top of what happens transmission level. This is quite a big issue when you have lots of rooftop PV. At the moment, this is completely invisible. So the way that we look at the integration in operation and planning would, if in fact, enable to understand much better and to have communications, a form of, for example, emergency control down to distributed energy resources that could facilitate all the security requirements and methodologies. For example, think on nodal dynamic operating envelopes, for example. At the moment, we look at them in terms of how we need to somehow curtail renewables to prevent higher voltages, for example, in some areas. Well, in fact, in the moment that, for example, the system operator were to identify that there is a very serious risk of sympathetic tripping of distributed PV, like we see, for example, in South Australia or even more in Western Australia. One idea is actually you can use the dynamic operating envelopes to provide security services. Then say curtail down, for example, rooftop PV, not because of the voltages in distribution, but because there is a system level security requirement to do that. So actually, by introducing this intelligence, you create new opportunities to make the system more secure from a technical perspective. Use technologies that we're now implementing to take care of the kind of the distribution networks. And on top of that, of course, you can create opportunities to understand better how to value these services. For example, these emergency services, should they be valued or not? Should we add? Should we somehow compensate, consumers, for example, to do that? I think there are quite some discussions we can open, but such as I see it, this kind of new world can create more opportunities to make the grid a lot more secure than it is today.
Excellent.
And I'll just add that from an operational and planning perspective, it's certainly going to be more complex as the distribution system becomes more active. And particularly as we're still learning, like we'll be learning about how willing customers are to orchestrate, the firmness of that orchestration. But it's essentially an entire new function for us that is looks very different to the traditional functions that the distribution networks paid, and that we might need an LV control center in the future, in the short term dealing with flexible exports, but potentially DOEs and flexible load sources in the future too. So yes, certainly more complex. And
Charlotte, that's a great lead into the next question as well from Jude around what are those gaps, and we see that there's transmission operators and what they've got to do, there's market operator, what they've got to do, there's distribution system and what they're doing in terms of operation. But we're now actually looking for collaboration across those and to manage between. And I think part of the beauty of the approach, and something that I only understood when sort of looking at the comparisons to alternatives that Pierluigi, the research raised, is that the investment coupled approach really helps the groups look separately at this, but there is that need to operate together in a cooperative manner. Are there any proposed models or structures for this, or is this just a gap that we need to sensibly work through as a sector to address?
Well, there's a lot of trials and discussion around this issue. Well, I think we're learning a lot about how different models are working, and there's a lot of coordination across the industry, with lots of different parties happening through those trials as well. And it's something that I'm expecting will be evolving quite quickly over the next year or so, as we really need to start moving towards actually operationalizing this flexibility.
Okay. Hugo's asked, to what extent have we modelled the economics and you know, how the returns could come. Pierluigi, could you maybe just give us a bit of an insight into that techno-economic aspect of how this has been put together? Hugo does ask around, you know, do we have a view on network charges and how should they be structured? And I'd address that by saying network charges are only one little component within this. What we would say is, again, all of the actors in here, the generators, the system operators, the asset owners, etc. Actually, what we need to do is look at the alignment of all of their economic gains and the incentives that sit there for them to get them to act in a way that is consistent to lowering the cost for all. So network charges is one of those. But in terms of the techno-economics, can you take us through that, Pierluigi?
It is fundamentally some form of least cost planning that tries to align with what AIMA is doing, because one of the objectives was actually to do something that would be very consistent with the current industry practices. So all the aspects of then, as you were mentioning, how may you facilitate this, for example, via network tariffs, charges, consumer incentives, and so on, would sit on top of that, because there are many different ways of doing it. But from a fundamental technical, let's say minimum cost perspective, with technical constraints and technical considerations, if we will not see any value in doing that, then there is no point in moving forward, looking for incentives and so on. So that's why we took the approach. And again, on top of that, try to be as aligned as possible with current industry practices, so they could potentially implement it straight away.
Excellent, thank you. On a more regulatory side, Charlotte, Tim's asked a follow-up question around the AER 5-year reg resets and everything, and it was interesting that you mentioned, you know, you've put in your proposals, and these take long times to go, but this is a really fast-moving landscape. Any thoughts on how we address that mismatch at the moment of the timing and the reg cycle to be there?
Yeah, well, I mean, we'd love to see the regime move more towards some of the additional flexibility mechanisms that we see internationally. So in the UK, for example, I think networks are allowed to revisit their capital expenditure if demand is higher or lower than initially seen in their determination. And that's a link that our framework doesn't explicitly make at the moment within the 5 years. But we do have a regime where we can seek cost pass-throughs up or down should there be regulatory changes over the 5-year period, which something like faster electrification could be a result of a regulatory change. So there is some flexibility in that space. I don't think the answer is to go for shorter than 5-year regulatory periods, as everyone that's been involved in resets know how much work goes into those 5-year proposals. And it is important still that, you know, networks do have incentives to keep costs low during regulatory periods as well. But nonetheless, there's definitely an increased heightened uncertainty right now. And I think, you know, there will be a need to look at whether the regulatory framework does offer the best flexibility to fund distributors to continue to deliver good customer outcomes.
Interesting. So keep the 5-year framework, but augment around it to accommodate for the uncertainty. Is that, or the rapid change?
Yes, particularly in the demand space.
Right. One Pierluigi, Soraya Coates has asked around the dynamic response of DNSPs will be fairly rapid as CER resources and their level of coordinations change. Does the modelling consider theoretical or actual coordination? And how do you consider change over time, the dynamic nature of it?
Yeah, no, there's a very, very interesting question. I think, yeah, the modeling does it. It does it parametrically. So effectively, what the modeling does is considers all the flexibility options and all the cost functions, how they change across time with, for example, the penetration level of distributed energy resources, consumer energy resources, and so on, and the level of orchestration slash controllability, so to speak, active network management, and so on. And what you realize is that there is always a trade-off. So basically say, you increase your distributed resource penetration, your cost of investment, for example, can go up if you don't do anything intelligently. Then you introduce intelligence. You will need to spend some money to introduce intelligence and orchestrate and so on. But then the investment cost will go down. So basically, you have parametrically is like a space in a way. It's a multidimensional space of cost functions that looks at how the cost changes against how much how many resources, the amount of resources and the type of resources you have, as well as what you need to support in an intelligent way those resources. That would definitely map into more theoretical or more actual coordination levels. And then, of course, you need to understand when you perform the integrity analysis, where actually you would sit in terms of real developments. And then the kind of the assessment would tell you what is the best thing to do, because some point, for example, could be more efficient to build more network and not to use intelligence, because eventually what you can save is not enough to justify network postponement. But all of these kind of studies that you need to consider all together. That is the way that we model this. So it is all included in the methodology and in the modeling.
Well, Gore actually asks a question around that in terms of from the flexibility, needing the intelligent. To what degree is that intelligence needed, or to what degree is it already existing in the data that's available now?
So I think already existing, I think is smart meters information that could be more kind of readily available and closer also to real time. I think that would be very, very beneficial. So I think, this is the kind of direction, try to exploit more and more the technologies that we have, and to make it somehow closer to real time. Much of this intelligence is only being built now, including proper active distribution system management systems that somehow would potentially go down to the lower voltage levels. I think the technologies are somehow there, they exist. Now, are they being implemented or not? I think we need more of this kind of cost-benefit analysis that I described now, and understanding the trade-offs also between investing into intelligence, investing into networks at a distributed level, and then for the whole system.
Thank you. Charlotte, Siri's asked a question here around, you mentioned about how, all of these approaches that you've had in such a small space of time. I think you said 110 connections, 4.3 gigawatt over just the last year or two alone that was there. Are you actually out communicating opportunities and everything for flexible loads there, or are we still in a reasonably reactionary point of view, and then having to work through to how can you see a pathway through to where such opportunities could be flagged?
Yeah, well, we do have a lot of information that is available. And hi, Siri. We have data available on our website, and I know there's active rule changes and work going on around whether distributors publish the right level of data, but we also do fulfill ad hoc data requests from our major customers. We do have a customer team that's out there talking to our large customers too, so any feedback or requests can be funneled through to our organisation to fulfil. We also do have tariffs that are offered. We have large battery tariffs that have been a trial, but we're seeking to embed them as permanent tariffs in the next regulatory period that provide incentives for batteries to import and export at certain times, including an export payment. And that's all available on our website, and we're happy to provide further details as needed too.
Thank you. Ian Griffiths always comes up with some great questions, and lovely to have you join us. So have you got any thoughts now? And I know it's preliminary points here, but how could incentivizing of whole system cost be done when you're at the basis that we're shifting from has been around the new lines of asset bases, you know, the RABs and everything that are there. How do we shift? What are those steps towards incentivizing and aligning the incentives to move to whole of system cost?
That's a very big question. I mean, the way it currently works is, you know, we get the same return, whether it's a distribution investment or a transmission investment, but there's checks and balances in the framework to make sure that our investments are stacking up from an economic perspective and in the interest of customers. So I think whether we need to move to some sort of, I'm not convinced we need to move to some sort of incentive optimizing across the system, but I think that integrated planning and giving that visibility and confidence of where investments are optimal across the system is really important to fix that issue.
Well, I think you highlighted a couple of the disincentives that actually sit there at the moment. And so while you've got exposure to both sides, one of the challenges is across the NEM, the multiple distribution zones and everything, and how to look at that and absorb all as one and have a common framework. And that was, to me, one of the real beauties of the University of Melbourne approach here in how they came to it, because it helps look right across there. It's a hard one, Ian. I think the answer is yes. That's needed. Exactly how to do that. That's one of the really big questions that's there.
James, if I may add,
please.
something, because I mean, there is another piece of work, obviously, in the SPV that looks exactly looks into the valuation of network versus non-network solutions. That doesn't address directly the issue of the whole system cost and incentives, but addresses somehow the issue of how efficient it is to keep building assets rather than using flexibility. So I think, you know, there are methodologies there that are being developed to assess more properly network versus non-network solutions. And these methodologies can be applied both at transmission level and distribution level. Some points I was seeing in the future planning, this kind of planning at distribution level happening where effectively the ESPs or future DSOs would efficiently take into account the value of non-network solutions and flexibility provided by DR, CR, and so on. Similarly, when you go to transmission level, the transmission, the planners, the TSPs, whoever needs to do it, would look at the distribution itself and all the resources coming from distribution effectively as a non-network solutions. So at the transmission level, the non-network solution becomes all the flexibility that can be accessed at the distribution level. Because effectively say, we can rely on the distribution network to provide some form of flexibility that could displace transmission asset. That is effectively a non-network solution at the transmission level. So we just need to understand better how all this kind of methodologies and frameworks that we're building would then translate into actual regulatory implementations. But I think we are, you know, all the right steps somehow are there to move in that direction.
And does that even then account for differences between distribution systems, so that the cost of flexibility might be different delivered in one distribution system to another, and can be quite temporal?
Absolutely. I mean, the way that we looked into this modeling is like, and then we developed the methodology, is each distribution network would develop that kind of assessment of flexibility and cost functions associated with flexibility. So at some point, let's say, imagine this extreme case. IMO could access, in a certain area of the transmission network, two different distribution networks, with two different DSPs, for example, with the different flexibility and cost. Eventually, these two can both provide services. To some extent, in operation and planning, let's say, compete to provide services at the transmission level. But effectively, these will have different costs, different cost functions. And then from the whole system perspective, we should try to understand where these costs sit and what is the optimal way of operating the grid, given the different flexibility costs in operation, and then planning the grid, given different costs for different networks.
Okay. We'll wrap up soon. Ian had placed a comment in here as well, which added on to Charlotte what you were talking about before around the time function and everything, and how we need to move quickly. Ian, one thing I would encourage here is to have a look at the research, because the approach taken and the parametric approach is not. I know there's a whole of a planning and system move. How do we do that? But actually within the solutions that are prioritized or show which steps to take, it's also about sequencing. There was quite a bit on the sequencing of which assets go in place, in which time, in which place, actually affects that overall cost. And that's because of the driving of the flexibility in there. Pierluigi, I probably haven't done that justice, but please feel free to.
No, that was good. Exactly, James. Exactly. It basically effectively say, if you unlock intelligent flexibility with in a proactive way, so to speak, in an anticipatory way, eventually you can save cost much earlier potentially, and then there is very significant value. There's basically an option value in doing that. So the sequencing is very important, but you need to be having like kind of proactive, longer term horizon, and kind of understand what scenarios you may have in front of you, and then deal with that. That is exactly where dealing with uncertainty becomes more important, and non-network solutions are very good to do that, more than the network asset.
And then, so we'll in finish up. Just Tim asked a question again. There's a statement. Actually, I'll preface this by saying we have actually spoken about dynamic operating envelopes in a couple of ways today. So we may need just some clarification on that. The dynamic operating envelopes around the limitations on customer connections and everything. But there was also quite the concept in there of parametric assessment using nodal operating envelopes, which is sort of taking a very similar concept, but applying at different parts of the grid in a way to have a uniform approach across different types. So, but look, to your point, which is around the consumers and really just wanting to save, you say, isn't the real opportunity to use DOEs to drive greater productivity from network infrastructure, tariffs that remove volumetric friction unless there is actual congestion and activate significant energy cost efficiency? One of the parts of the ESP project very much found that it recommended using the DOEs, and that they can help both connect more assets to the grid, albeit not changing the network hosting capacity that sits there. So there is greater curtailment that comes with that, but it does allow greater connection because the safety nets are in place. But I'll throw to maybe Pierluigi and then Charlotte just to finish off with then just on any thoughts then on Tim's question around the actual congestion and ability to significant cost efficiencies.
Yep. No. I think definitely it's something that it's important to do. However, if you look at the economics of this, I mean, it also depends on how much it will cost, right? So from a cost-benefit analysis, what is the true value of this congestion? So what is the true value of curtailment? And is it better perhaps just to curtail some energy and let it go, and then I'll try some ways to compensate, for example, rather than building an entire infrastructure when actually the savings may not be so justified. This is looking at exports. I think the export issue, to be honest, it's a technical issue that is important we are trying to address. But the real issue is when it comes to imports. So when you come to imports, you basically cannot operate in a techno-economic efficient way, the grid of the future, without having something like dynamic operating envelopes. You may use as much as you can pricing to try to drive demand down at peak times and so on, but actually have a physical lever like DOEs would really help saving significant amounts of money, because eventually, as I was showing before, the network becomes very peaky, but that cannot be controlled. So when we control flexible imports, like when we have lots of electric vehicles that we can flexibly control, we don't know exactly how to do it. Again, it's not really control. There are different ways there. But having the opportunity of using intelligently dynamic operating envelopes to do that, they can really save money, because there is definitely significant value that we see, because we need much bigger networks to deal with electrification than we need now to deal with PV exports.
And both on dealing with that peak management, but also being able to harness it to in somewhat address the exports as well in
that would be done almost as you will do both, but what is the driver? It will be
avoid the peak. Yep. Charlotte?
Yeah, I strongly agree with what Pierluigi just set out. I think that's exactly the solution. But the next big challenge is bringing customers along on the journey, because it's a very big change for them for how they've used energy, even if they don't have to actively participate in responding to DOEs, and how we communicate that value to get their buy-in that is the optimal solution for the greater good.
Excellent. Pierluigi and Charlotte, thank you so much. To be able to draw on such expertise for this audience is great. The audience itself, thank you so much for your participation, your questions, and everything. The level of interest in this has been very, very high, and I'm sure this webinar will drive that further. Please keep an eye out for the ESP results that we will be launching shortly. We welcome your engagement and discussion on it. We will host a further webinar on it as well. In the meantime, I'd like to say thank you. Thanks to our participants and also the tech team who have helped us put this together today. Thank you.
Thank you.